Welcome from Caregiver Cloud to our course on Abuse and Neglect number 1, which includes exploitation. Every healthcare professional is responsible for knowing about the different types of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. In this course, you will learn how to recognize the signs and what to do if you observe abuse or neglect. As a direct care provider, you are responsible for keeping your patients and clients safe from abuse and neglect. Vulnerable groups include children, the disabled, and the elderly. Each state has a reporting process to follow if you observe abuse or neglect. Let's start by understanding more about abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Abuse, neglect, and exploitation are illegal acts which harm vulnerable people. Abuse is the intentional harm or threat of harm to a vulnerable person. Abuse may occur once, or it may occur repeatedly, sometimes for years. Abuse may be physical, emotional, or sexual. An abuser is often in a position of power over the person being abused. An abuser is usually someone known by the person being abused. An example of physical abuse is a teacher who strikes an unruly student. Other examples of abuse include burning, beating, cutting, kicking, or shoving a victim. People who suffer from disabilities are often victims of emotional and mental abuse. Mental and emotional abuse may cause permanent mental scars. Someone who has power over a vulnerable person may use verbal abuse, criticism, threats, manipulation, and belittling tactics to cause emotional damage. An example of emotional abuse is a counselor who calls a developmentally delayed person dumb. Sexual abuse is a specific type of physical abuse. Sexual abuse is any form of sexual contact or activity which occurs without a victim's consent. Sexual abuse includes touching, intercourse, masturbation, watching pornography, deliberately spreading sexually transmitted infections, and forced prostitution. An example of sexual abuse includes a caregiver who touches the breasts of a female client unnecessarily. Another example of sexual abuse is a family member who watches sexually explicit movies with a developmentally delayed child. If the abuse victim is a child or someone who does not have the capacity to choose, sexual activity is considered to be sexual abuse even if the victim consents. Neglect is different than abuse, so let's discuss. Neglect is the deliberate failure to provide necessary care or assistance that causes physical, emotional, or mental harm to a victim. Neglect can include the failure to provide adequate clothing, food, medical care, supervision, or shelter. An example of neglect is a caregiver who does not provide clean clothes or nutritious food for the client in their care. Self-neglect can occur when an adult does not take care of their own basic needs. A person who is neglecting themselves may not eat well, bathe, or take care of their medical issues. A person who is neglecting themselves may also put themselves in physical, emotional, or mental danger. Many times, elderly or disabled people are not able to care for themselves properly, resulting in self-neglect. Now let's talk about exploitation. Exploitation is the misuse of a person's money, property, or dignity by another person. People who exploit others may steal or use threats or trickery to take advantage of others. Elderly people are particularly vulnerable to exploitation of their funds. An example of exploitation is a family member who receives Social Security funds to care for her disabled son. Instead of using the money for the son's needs, they spend the Social Security funds to pay for a personal vacation to Las Vegas. As a caregiver, What should you do if you observe or suspect abuse, neglect, or exploitation? The law is very clear. All persons who are employed, licensed, registered, or certified to provide care to children and vulnerable adults are required by law to report possible occurrences of abuse, neglect, and exploitation to Child or Adult Protective Services. Required reporters include healthcare, education, social services, law enforcement, and human services workers. If a caregiver or respite worker suspects possible abuse, they must first notify their supervisor. The caregiver or respite worker also has the responsibility of reporting the suspected abuse to the state's Protective Services Agency. As much factual information as possible should be provided. Every state has a hotline for reporting possible cases of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. In addition to state protective agencies, emergency medical assistance and/or law enforcement may need to be summoned if a vulnerable individual is injured or at risk for abuse. In conclusion, the health and safety of the client is always the primary concern. This concludes the Caregiver Cloud course on Abuse and Neglect Number 1, which includes exploitation. Copyright 2016, all rights reserved, Caregiver Cloud, LLC.